June 1944. The Pacific sun was merciless. Smoke drifted over the shattered cliffs of Saipan. Amid the rubble, a lone Japanese private, barefoot, his uniform torn to ribbons, stumbled from the brush, hands trembling, clutching a white scrap torn from his undershirt. American rifles tracked him from the ridge. Silence. Then, a medic raised a hand. "Hold fire!" They led the prisoner to a field station. He expected a rifle butt, a knife, death. Instead, he was given water. His wounds were cleaned with gauze and iodine. And then, something he could not understand, a cup of tea. He stared at the steaming tin mug as if it were a trick. The sergeant spoke gently. "Drink. You're safe now." For the first time in his life, Private Kenji Sato, once told that capture was a disgrace worse than death, felt the crushing weight of disbelief. He had surrendered to the enemy, and the enemy had answered with kindness. The question was no longer about survival. It was about why the Americans treated their captives this way. Before that moment of tea and mercy on Saipan, there was a lifetime of belief that such a thing could never happen. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not a tactical option. It was moral extinction. The code of no surrender in the 1930s. As Japan expanded across Asia, a new military creed hardened its soldiers. Rooted in the centuries-old Bushidō, the way of the warrior, the Imperial Army's doctrine fused the samurai's stoicism with modern nationalism. To die for the emperor was the highest virtue. To be captured was shame beyond redemption. Training manuals declared, "The soldier who surrenders is no longer human." From Manchuria to the jungles of Burma, officers drilled recruits not only in marksmanship, but in spiritual resilience. The enemy, they were told, was barbaric. Americans in particular were depicted in propaganda leaflets and classroom films as monsters, torturers of prisoners, violators of women, desecrators of the emperor's sacred soil. The psychological wall. This mental fortress meant that early in the Pacific War, Japanese troops fought to the last man. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Attu, nearly every defender died. Surrender rates were microscopic, sometimes fewer than 1%. Even the wounded pulled grenades beneath their blankets when capture loomed. When U.S. Marines stormed Tarawa in 1943, they found 4,700 Japanese dead. Only 17 survived. American commanders began to wonder whether the Japanese were physically incapable of surrendering. The truth was deeper. Surrender was a social death sentence. Families back home often received notice not of capture, but of honorable death in battle. Those who did survive as prisoners were erased from village registries, their names unspoken. The legal divide internationally. Japan had refused to ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. The imperial government believed its moral system, based on Bushido and military honor, was superior to Western codes. Yet this decision had consequences. While Japanese soldiers were bound by their commander's orders, their captors, especially the United States, were bound by law. The U.S. Army and Navy were required to follow the Geneva Protocols strictly. Every captured combatant was to receive medical care, food rations equivalent to American troops, and protection from public curiosity or humiliation. Even as the war grew more brutal, the American command tried, at least officially, to maintain this standard. A 1943 War Department manual instructed soldiers, "The Japanese soldier is entitled to humane treatment. His cooperation will increase when treated fairly." It was part morality, part pragmatism. Early encounters and mistrust, but in the field, ideals often clashed with fury. After the Bataan Death March and reports of Japanese atrocities in China, many U.S. troops viewed mercy as betrayal. The Pacific was personal, its battles feral, close, and emotional. Capturing a Japanese soldier alive was rare, protecting one from an enraged squad even rarer. Accounts from Guadalcanal reveal that early prisoners were sometimes killed moments after surrender. Marines later admitted they simply didn't believe surrender was real, assuming every gesture of submission was a ruse for suicide attacks. By 1944, however, This attitude began to change. Intelligence officers noticed something. When prisoners were taken alive and treated decently, they talked. They revealed garrison strengths, logistics, morale levels, details that no amount of torture could force from a man who considered death preferable to dishonor. The revelation was clear. Humane treatment wasn't weakness. It was strategic power. A shift toward strategy. Under orders from the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service, new surrender protocols were drafted. Field units were encouraged to accept prisoners, not kill them. Leaflets written in Japanese were airdropped over islands promising safety, food, and medical care to those who surrendered. And at the heart of this shift stood a quiet irony. Compassion, long dismissed as softness, had become a weapon. By mid-1944, when the battle for Saipan erupted, the U.S. military was experimenting with a radical idea in modern warfare, that psychological victory could begin not with a bullet, but with a gesture of humanity. The steam of that small cup of tea, offered to a frightened soldier, was the condensation of years of cultural misunderstanding, military discipline, and slow strategic evolution. It marked the moment when policy met morality on the battlefield, and both would be tested in the months to come. By the summer of 1944, the United States had developed one of the most sophisticated systems for handling prisoners of war in modern history. It was not born of sentiment. It was built from policy, logistics, and intelligence necessity. The machinery of captivity. When Japanese soldiers surrendered on Pacific Islands, their journey followed a strict chain of custody. First came the frontline collection points, usually just a tent or sandbagged corner near a field hospital. From there, prisoners were registered, interrogated, and shipped to base camps behind the lines. Those deemed cooperative or of intelligence value were flown thousands of miles east, to Hawaii, Australia, or even the U.S. mainland. At each stage, American procedures were meticulous. Prisoners were deloused, given medical exams, and assigned serial numbers. They received U.S. Army rations, sometimes the same tinned meat and biscuits eaten by their captors. Their letters home were routed through the International Red Cross. The Geneva Convention was followed not out of naivete, but because it gave the Allies a moral and propaganda advantage. The American High Command understood that every humane act would echo through enemy lines, contradicting years of Japanese indoctrination, camps of order, and routine on U.S. soil. More than 5,000 Japanese POWs would eventually be held in nearly a dozen states: Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and beyond. Camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin or Camp Florence in Arizona became small, self-contained societies. Prisoners were put to work on farms, lumber yards, and road crews, earning token wages in canteen coupons. Daily life followed a rhythm: morning roll call, meals, supervised labor, evening recreation. Sports leagues formed. Shogi and go boards were carved from scrap wood. Choirs sang Japanese folk songs under the watch of curious American guards. What astonished many prisoners was the absence of humiliation. There were no beatings, no starvation. Some officers were even allowed to teach or organize cultural lectures. In the desert of Arizona, POWs tended gardens that reminded them of home, meticulously raked gravel, and rows of chrysanthemums under the sun. One captured sergeant later recalled in a 1946 Tokyo newspaper, "We had been told the Americans were beasts, yet they treated us as men." That was more frightening than hatred. The role of language and the Nisei communication was key. American intelligence had recruited hundreds of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, to serve as interpreters and interrogators. Many had families still trapped in Japan. Their work was delicate and dangerous. Some were spat on by their own countrymen for aiding the enemy. But it was their understanding of nuance, honorifics, silences, indirect phrasing, that opened the flow of information. A captured private might remain mute for days under Western questioning. Yet one soft-spoken Nisei interpreter, addressing him as Sato-kun, could unlock an entire division's disposition chart within an hour. Psychological and strategic purposes. Humane treatment had tactical logic. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Branch quickly realized that visible evidence of good treatment could erode the Japanese will to fight. Leaflets showed photographs of smiling prisoners receiving food and medical care. Loudspeakers on the front lines broadcast messages. "You will not be harmed. You will be fed. Lay down your arms." What began as isolated acts of compassion became policy-driven psychological warfare. Reports from Saipan and Tinian showed measurable results, as word spread among surviving Japanese troops that capture did not mean torture. More began to approach American lines waving white flags, or their makeshift substitutes, strips of cloth, or even bandages tied to sticks. Still, the process was painfully slow. Many could not believe the evidence of their eyes. Some POWs wept uncontrollably when shown food. Others refused to eat, convinced the rice was poisoned. The cultural collision inside those camps, two civilizations faced each other across a table of rations and tea. To Americans, humane treatment was a rule of law. To the Japanese, it was an existential paradox. A sergeant in Camp Florence wrote in his diary, "It is harder to live as a defeated man than to die as a soldier. But the Americans, by kindness, force us to live." In that paradox lay the heart of the story. The quiet battlefield where ideals of honor, mercy, and propaganda all collided. As the war pressed toward its brutal end, from Saipan to Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the question of humanity would not fade. It would evolve, because every act of mercy on the battlefield carried an unseen consequence. It planted the idea, however small, that surrender was survivable. By 1944, the Pacific War had become more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation between worldviews. Each prisoner taken alive, each act of compassion shown, became a test of the human mind under total war. The story of Japanese POWs in American hands cannot be told from a single perspective. It unfolds through overlapping lenses: human, tactical, and cultural, each revealing how dignity became a weapon as potent as any rifle. Angle 1. The human shock. Dignity as disbelief. The first wave of captured Japanese soldiers often reacted not with relief, but paralysis. They had been told that surrender was the path to torture. Yet when medics offered morphine, food, or a cigarette, they looked bewildered, as if awaiting the blow that never came. Many refused to speak, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they believed. Some whispered that it was all theater, that the Americans would kill them once they confessed. It took days, sometimes weeks, before trust appeared. American field reports described the same scene again and again. A prisoner silently eating rice for the first time in days, tears mixing with the grains. Another hesitantly sipping from a canteen held out by a Marine. This quiet compassion broke something stronger than a gun barrel. It cracked the wall of fear built by years of indoctrination. For many Japanese POWs, the moment of surrender marked not only the end of battle, but the beginning of self-doubt. Who was truly honorable? The soldier who died shouting "Tenno Heika Banzai," or the enemy who shared his rations with a prisoner? That confusion became the first tremor of change. The human soul, once conditioned to see death as duty, was now forced to see dignity in the hands of an enemy. Angle 2. The tactical layer. Information. Through humanity beneath the compassion was calculation. The U.S. Army understood that kindness was not charity. It was intelligence strategy. At the height of the Pacific Campaign, the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, was desperate for insights. Troop strengths, supply routes, morale, defensive layouts. Torture was banned and often futile. But prisoners who were fed, clothed, and treated respectfully spoke more freely. Reports from the 41st Infantry Division in New Guinea showed that Japanese POWs, once convinced of fair treatment, revealed critical information about artillery positions and evacuation routes. One prisoner's map sketch helped direct an entire air raid that saved hundreds of American lives. The MIS called this psychological debriefing. It was interrogation built on empathy. Nisei interpreters were trained not to threaten but to listen, to ask about families, hometowns, and unit pride before turning to military questions. Kindness opened the door. Curiosity held it open. By 1945, captured Japanese officers had provided intelligence that shaped invasion plans for Luzon and Iwo Jima. Every act of humane treatment rippled outward, producing both moral vindication and military advantage. To many in the command structure, this was proof that humanity and pragmatism were not opposites. They were allies. Winning hearts could also win wars. Angle 3. The cultural bridge. Saving face through mercy, yet the deepest transformation was cultural. For Japanese soldiers raised in a hierarchy of shame, surrender destroyed personal identity. To live under an enemy's mercy was unbearable, unless that mercy restored a fragment of honor. American officers, often advised by Nisei cultural experts, learned to navigate this emotional terrain. They avoided open humiliation. They saluted Japanese officers, allowed small ceremonies of respect, and even returned swords to cooperative captives as symbolic gestures. These moments mattered. They allowed prisoners to reinterpret survival not as cowardice, but as a chance to serve the emperor again, through endurance rather than death. In some camps, chaplains or translators organized Shinto observances. Prisoners were invited to teach Japanese language classes to guards or write cultural essays. Slowly, the American camp system began to act not only as a place of confinement, but as an accidental school of reconciliation. Letters intercepted by intelligence services revealed a pattern. "The Americans are not devils," one prisoner wrote to his wife in Tokyo. "They bow when they speak to us. Perhaps they too have hearts." For a government built on the myth of divine superiority, such words were dangerous. But for history they were seeds of understanding, proof that cultural bridges could be built even in the ashes of total war. From these three angles, the human, the tactical, and the cultural, emerges a truth that defies propaganda: the power of empathy in warfare. Yet the story does not end with the quiet of camp life. For beyond the wire, generals and psychologists were turning these experiences into formal policy. And within the prisoners themselves, a new conflict brewed, between loyalty to the emperor and gratitude toward their captors. As months turned into years, the encounter between captor and captive grew more complex. What had begun as an improvised act of mercy evolved into a multi-layered experiment in power, persuasion, and morality. The second half of this story reveals how leadership directives, enemy resistance, and moral warfare intertwined, reshaping not only the Pacific conflict, but the very definition of victory. Angle 4. The command view, discipline and doctrine. In Washington and Honolulu, the humane treatment of Japanese POWs was not left to chance. It was policy, written in ink and enforced by command. By late 1943, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters had distributed strict guidelines to all units in the Southwest Pacific. Prisoners were to be respected, recorded, and safeguarded. Commanders were reminded that mistreatment of enemy personnel is a violation of both military law and American principle. Behind these orders was intelligence logic, but also reputation management. The U.S. could not afford to appear barbaric while denouncing Axis atrocities. Propaganda was a battlefield of its own. Camp commandants received training manuals detailing everything from diet portions to disciplinary procedures. "Respect the customs of the Japanese soldier," one directive read. "Humiliation breeds silence. Respect breeds cooperation." Many officers took this seriously. Colonel Howard Kenyon, who oversaw a POW facility in the Philippines, wrote that his goal was to defeat Japan by disproving Japan's lies. To him, the clean beds and orderly kitchens were not luxuries. They were evidence that democracy itself could function under fire. This official tone did not erase every abuse. There were incidents of revenge, moments of cruelty, but it established a framework where dignity was command policy, not moral accident. Angle 5. The enemy within. Resistance, suicide, and shame even inside the fences. The war did not end. For many Japanese prisoners, the enemy was no longer America. It was themselves. Suicide remained common, especially among officers. Some used smuggled razor blades or refused food for weeks. Others formed secret groups to enforce discipline, punishing fellow prisoners who cooperated with Americans. At Camp McCoy, a sergeant who translated for U.S. officers was found dead behind the mess hall, stabbed by his own countrymen. The Imperial Army's code followed them into captivity. The word surrender itself, kofuku, was avoided. Instead, prisoners called their status horyo, detained soldiers. They clung to rituals, bowing to the east, muttering the emperor's name before sleep, keeping invisible ranks in daily routines. American guards noticed. They were still soldiers, one corporal wrote in a 1945 diary. Even in chains, they stood in formation. This resistance forced camp officers to adapt. Chaplains, psychologists, and interpreters were brought in to understand the invisible battle of shame. The goal was no longer just to house prisoners, it was to prevent spiritual collapse. Some prisoners eventually broke free of the indoctrination. They began helping Americans understand Japanese tactics, writing manuals for future campaigns. But many more remained haunted. Living reminders that mercy cannot always rewrite the human code of honor. Angle 6. The Moral Front, Propaganda and Perception. By 1944, the U.S. War Department had realized that compassion could travel farther than any bomber. Leaflet campaigns were launched across the Pacific, each carrying messages in Japanese. You will be treated well. You will live. Photos showed captured soldiers smiling, bandaged, drinking tea. Loudspeaker teams, often staffed by Nisei linguists, approached battlefields at night, broadcasting soft voices into the darkness. The wounded will be cared for. Surrender is not shameful. You will see your families again. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. It targeted not the enemy's body, but his belief system. The Japanese High Command responded with fury. Captured leaflets were labeled as poison words. Soldiers were ordered to burn them on sight. But the seed was planted. By the time the Allies landed on Okinawa, more Japanese troops were surrendering than ever before in the Pacific Campaign. Propaganda had turned morality into strategy. The act of mercy was now weaponized, not to kill, but to compel. Yet there was an unintended consequence. American soldiers, witnessing prisoners treated with kindness, began to see their own enemies as human again. In the midst of a war defined by firebombs and kamikazes, empathy became the quiet rebellion against hatred. These 6 angles, human, tactical, cultural, command, internal, and moral, form the anatomy of an idea that defied the logic of total war, that compassion could serve strategy without betraying strength. But this theory would face its ultimate test as the Pacific War reached its most brutal stage. On the islands of Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, where surrender was rare, and mercy was a risk. Saipan, June 1944. The island of no surrender. The U.S. invasion of Saipan was supposed to last a week. It took nearly a month. By the time the island was secured, more than 29,000 Japanese soldiers and 22,000 civilians were dead. Yet amid the wreckage, something else emerged. A transformation, both tragic and profound. American forces encountered surrender on a scale they had never seen in the Pacific, but it came wrapped in horror. Many Japanese soldiers, conditioned to view capture as dishonor, took their families with them off the cliffs of Marpi Point. Mothers leapt with infants in their arms, their screams echoing over the surf. To the Americans, the scene was unbearable. Leaflets had promised safety. Loudspeakers had begged surrender. Yet fear was stronger than logic. Then, something began to change. A handful of Japanese soldiers, exhausted, wounded, starving, stumbled out of caves waving scraps of white cloth. They expected to die. Instead, they were carried to medical tents, bandaged and given water. Among them were civilians, women and children trembling under the gaze of Marines. The soldiers laid down their rifles and bowed their heads, expecting the bullet. But the bullet never came. American medics gave the wounded tea. Chaplains spoke softly through interpreters. Some Marines offered cigarettes, others shared rations. The compassion spread not as an order, but as instinct. Photographs later circulated among Allied command. Japanese prisoners sitting cross-legged beside American corpsmen, sharing rice and canned peaches. For a world used to bayonets and bombs, the image looked almost impossible. This was the quiet climax, the moment when propaganda collided with reality. The turning of minds. U.S. intelligence quickly realized what had happened on Saipan could reshape the entire Pacific front. If Japanese troops saw that capture was survivable, that Americans were not the demons their officers had described, then perhaps the cycle of suicidal resistance could be broken. Leaflet units multiplied. Field loudspeakers were deployed in larger numbers. The messages were simple. You are wounded. You will live. Lay down your arms. Every captured man was now a potential voice. POWs were asked to record messages in Japanese, urging their comrades to surrender. I am alive, they would say. The Americans have fed me. They have treated my wounds. You can live too. The broadcasts were transmitted toward enemy lines at dusk, when the wind carried sound the farthest. At first, few listened. But on smaller islands like Guam and Peleliu, Marines began noticing something new. White flags fluttering from trenches before dawn. The T of Trustin, the reports of the 2nd Marine Division. One small note stands out. After the battle, captured prisoners were gathered in a makeshift camp on Saipan's western shore. An American officer ordered the cooks to brew tea for them. Not coffee, not rations, tea. The one taste that would feel familiar. The prisoners were stunned. Some bowed repeatedly. Others broke down crying. The officer later wrote in his journal, "We made tea because we wanted them to know we understood they were human." That cup of tea became a quiet symbol, a gesture repeated in later campaigns. It was not military science. It was empathy turned into policy. Humanity as warfare. For every act of compassion, there were still moments of savagery. On neighboring Tinian, captured Japanese civilians were sometimes beaten by local guides seeking revenge. On Guam, a few prisoners were shot during surrender confusion. But by the end of 1944, American command had learned a critical lesson. The treatment of one prisoner could influence the surrender of hundreds. Field manuals began including surrender procedures as tactical operations. Medics were trained to secure POWs alongside the wounded. Nisei interpreters were stationed at surrender points to calm the terrified. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare. One fought not for territory, but for the minds of men still willing to die for honor. And yet, the ultimate test of this philosophy was still to come. Because in the final year of the war, the U.S. would land on islands where Bushidō ran deeper than fear, where surrender was not simply shameful, but impossible. Prelude to the last battles as 1945 dawned, two words defined the Pacific War: Okinawa and Okinawa's hell. It was the largest amphibious assault of the campaign and the bloodiest. The lessons of Saipan, the leaflets, the broadcasts, the humane treatment, would now face their most brutal test against an enemy cornered, desperate, and burning with fanatic resolve. The soldiers who had once offered tea to prisoners would soon find themselves facing men who preferred fire to surrender. Yet even there, amid the caves of Okinawa, the idea of humanity as strategy would refuse to die. Because in the chaos of flame and mud, compassion had already proved its power once, and would again. Okinawa, 1945. The final lesson in Mercy. April 1st, 1945. The sea around Okinawa was burning. Shells from American battleships thundered into the ridges. Kamikazes rained from the sky. For both sides, this was the last step before the invasion of Japan itself, and both knew it. By now, U.S. psychological units had perfected their messages. Leaflets fluttered down from B-29s, promising medical care and safe passage. Loudspeakers shouted through the smoke, "You will not be killed. The war is ending. Come forward." But on the ground, the myth of the merciful enemy collided head-on with the terror of dishonor. Japanese commanders ordered mass suicides. Civilians hid in caves. Whole families huddled together as grenades exploded in their hands. And yet, amid the ruin, there were glimmers. Tiny, stubborn acts of faith. The surrenders that defied death. On May 14th, a group of 20 Japanese soldiers, starving and disoriented, crawled from a hillside near Shuri Castle. They expected execution. Instead, American medics gave them blankets and hot soup. One of them, Corporal Hideo Nakamura, wrote years later, "They treated my wounds before asking my name. I thought it was a trick. It was not." More followed. In the chaos of Okinawa, hundreds surrendered, more than at any previous battle in the Pacific. Word had spread from Saipan and Guam that surrender meant life, not torture. The idea had survived air raids, propaganda, and shame. It moved quietly from man to man, like a rumor of mercy. For U.S. commanders, this was vindication. The policy of humane treatment, once questioned, even mocked, was saving American lives. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered was one less fanatic charging with a bayonet. But the transformation was not only tactical, it was moral. Inside the caves in the dark tunnels of Okinawa, interpreters risked their lives to deliver messages of mercy. One Nisei translator, Sergeant Alan Nakata, entered a cave with a bullhorn, calling out in Japanese, "Wounded soldiers, come out. We will not harm you. We will give you water." He heard silence, then a faint voice. Slowly, a young Japanese medic appeared, carrying a white flag made from a shirt. Behind him, half a dozen wounded followed. They laid down their rifles and bowed low. Nakata's commanding officer later wrote, "It wasn't firepower that brought them out. It was trust. That trust, fragile and hard-won, was now doing what bombs could not, ending battles without blood." The battle for humanity. The humane treatment of prisoners had begun as policy, but in Okinawa it became defiance. Defiance against hatred, against revenge, against the very instinct of war. For many American troops, the memories of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and the kamikaze attacks still burned. Compassion was not easy. In moments of rage, mercy felt unnatural. But orders were orders, and the discipline of decency held. At one collection point near Naha, a Marine lieutenant found himself facing a dozen terrified Japanese teenagers. They were barely soldiers, barely alive. He hesitated, then told his men, "Holster your weapons." They gave the prisoners water, wrapped them in blankets, and sat in silence. The lieutenant would later say, "We didn't win that day by killing. We won by remembering who we were." The U.S. military had discovered something extraordinary. Morality could be strategic, echoes beyond the battlefield as the guns fell silent. Reports of POW treatment reached Tokyo through captured letters and intercepted radio broadcasts. Some officers dismissed them as lies. Others began to question what their own government had told them. One Japanese naval officer, taken prisoner in Okinawa and later repatriated, described his realization. They had no reason to be kind, yet they were. It destroyed everything I had been taught. This realization would linger long after the last battle ended. It was the seed of reconciliation. The idea that even in total defeat, humanity could survive. The psychological victory by war's end. The United States held nearly 50,000 Japanese prisoners of war across the Pacific and mainland America. Few had been tortured. Many had been re-educated, fed, and treated for disease. Intelligence units compiled extensive reports proving that humane policies yielded more reliable information and reduced resistance. Psychologists noted that surrender rates increased by up to 30% in areas where captured soldiers' voices were broadcast back to their comrades. The battlefield had proved what philosophers had argued for centuries. Mercy can be pragmatic. The curtain falls. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, Millions of soldiers across Asia laid down their weapons. For the first time, Japanese troops marched into captivity not in chains, but under watchful yet restrained Allied eyes. Among them were men who had once stood on Saipan's cliffs, ready to die. Now they walked toward the unknown, and were met, once again, not with bullets, but with tea. A tradition had begun, one small gesture of humanity that transcended the war's bitterness. In the end, the U.S. had not only defeated an empire of steel, it had challenged an empire of belief. The transformation that began on the beaches of Saipan had come full circle on Okinawa's scorched hills. And from that, smoke rose a single enduring question. If mercy could win a war, what else could it change? Counting the living. When the Pacific guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world confronted a strange arithmetic. How many had survived because of mercy? Across the U.S. network of camps, from Hawaii to the Midwest, nearly 50,000 Japanese prisoners of war were alive. Each one represented a story that had nearly ended on a battlefield. A man who had expected to die but instead found himself in a wooden barracks thousands of miles from home. In Arizona, at Camp Florence, POWs tended vegetable gardens and worked on road crews. In Wisconsin's Camp McCoy, others built furniture, harvested crops, or even played baseball with American guards. These images, captured in black and white by U.S. Army photographers, looked surreal to those who had fought through Saipan or Iwo Jima. Here were the men who had shouted, "Banzai!" and charged with bayonets, now raking sand or mending fences under the same sun as their former enemies. But behind that calm order lay complex emotions. Many prisoners remained haunted by shame. They refused mail, destroyed photographs, and hid their faces from cameras. Others began to write again, letters carefully censored but filled with quiet wonder. One POW's message to his wife read, "I am alive because the Americans believe life has value. It confuses me, but I am grateful." The machinery of repatriation. In 1946, as Japan began to rebuild, the Allied powers organized massive repatriation operations. Japanese POWs were gradually returned from Guam, the Philippines, and the American mainland. Ships like the USS General Gordon and USS Anderson ferried thousands back across the Pacific. Each man carried not only his uniform and identification card, but a new perception of the enemy. When they reached Yokosuka or Kure, most stepped ashore in silence. Some bowed to the harbor. Others wept openly. They were not greeted as heroes. Many families had already received notice of their death in battle. Now, these ghosts of war were walking home. A 1946 Japanese government report estimated that over 90% of returning POWs experienced social stigma. Villages often rejected them. Some took new names to avoid disgrace. Yet among this rejection, a few carried another seed, something they had seen in American camps: fairness, order, respect. They spoke quietly of guards who shared meals, chaplains who bowed, officers who kept promises. To a nation grappling with defeat, these testimonies became fragments of a new moral vocabulary. From captivity to cooperation. Within a few years, those same men would become the human bridge between two former enemies. Some ex-POWs worked as interpreters for American occupation forces. Others became teachers, journalists, or diplomats. A few even helped shape the emerging constitution of post-war Japan, which renounced war forever as a sovereign right. Historians later traced a subtle but powerful connection. Many of these men had been treated humanely during captivity. That experience, of being respected rather than destroyed, had shown them that democracy was not weakness, but restraint in strength. In 1947, when the U.S. began releasing the last groups of prisoners from its mainland camps, the War Department issued a report to Congress. The humane treatment of Japanese prisoners has contributed materially to the psychological reconstruction of Japan. It was not propaganda. It was a statement of fact. The Red Cross and the mirror of humanity. The International Red Cross, which had monitored POW camps during the war, confirmed similar findings. Their inspectors described the Japanese prisoners as well-fed, decently housed, and employed in productive labor. The contrast with Japan's own treatment of Allied POWs on the Burma Railway, in the Philippines, in China, was stark. For the Japanese, this realization would come painfully, as evidence of their own wartime atrocities surfaced during the Tokyo trials. Yet, many survivors found a strange comfort in one truth: that mercy had been possible even when the world was burning. The story of the tea on Saipan, retold in letters and testimonies, became a quiet symbol, a moment when the human spirit refused to sink beneath hatred. As ships continued to carry men home across the Pacific, the waves seemed to whisper the same paradox: that kindness, too, leaves scars. Lessons etched in the ashes. The Pacific War left the world in ruins, but in its aftermath, the conduct of the United States toward its prisoners stood out as a deliberate act of restraint amid catastrophe. Even as American bombers leveled cities and atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the treatment of Japanese POWs remained remarkably consistent, lawful, structured, and above all, humane. In post-war hearings and historical reviews, Allied investigators found almost no evidence of systemic mistreatment of Japanese captives under U.S. supervision. Individual cases of abuse existed, but they were prosecuted swiftly. For a war so filled with vengeance, this consistency was extraordinary. To many historians, it was the moral high ground of the Pacific Campaign, the proof that democracy could fight without losing its soul. The reversal of image. In the months following Japan's surrender, American occupation forces broadcast radio interviews with former POWs who described their captivity. They spoke of food, fair treatment, and the bewildering kindness of guards who bowed before them. To a Japanese public still steeped in wartime propaganda, these testimonies were disorienting. The enemy had not only won the war, it had behaved with unexpected decency. The same soldiers who once called Americans devils now spoke of them as disciplined, courteous, even compassionate. A cultural reversal had begun. Schools reopened under Allied supervision. Teachers, journalists, and intellectuals, many of them veterans, began re-examining the moral codes that had driven Japan's militarism. The Bushidō that once glorified death was quietly reframed as a code of responsibility and honor through peace. In that transformation, the memory of humane captivity became part of the moral rebuilding of Japan. From surrender to partnership by 1947, the U.S. occupation had shifted from punishment to reconstruction. American advisors helped draft Japan's new constitution. Factories reopened. Food flowed in through U.S. aid. In that fragile atmosphere, trust was everything, and trust had been seeded years earlier. In POW camps where dignity was upheld under fire, many of the American officers who once guarded Japanese prisoners later worked in the occupation government. They found familiar faces, former POWs now serving as translators, clerks, and educators. One recalled recognizing a man he had once interrogated in New Guinea. The man bowed deeply and said in careful English, "I learned democracy from the camp." The phrase was simple but profound. The camp, once a symbol of defeat, had become a classroom for a nation's rebirth, a blueprint for future wars. The lessons of the Pacific would echo across decades. When the Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949, the U.S. delegation cited experiences from the war, including the humane handling of Axis prisoners, as evidence that, even in total war, legal restraint was possible. During the Korean War, many American officers carried field manuals modeled on those same wartime procedures. Psychological operations divisions reused leaflets and surrender messages almost word for word. The practice of showing mercy for strategic effect, born in the jungles of Saipan and the caves of Okinawa, became part of the U.S. military's moral doctrine. The human ledger still, not all stories ended in peace. Some Japanese prisoners never returned home, lost to history or exile. Others struggled to reconcile gratitude with guilt. A few took their own lives after repatriation, unable to face families who believed them dead. Yet thousands more carried something invisible, a memory of being treated as men when they expected to die as beasts. One ex-POW, interviewed in 1952, said softly, "They gave us tea, not to humiliate, but to remind us we were alive." That small kindness changed the way I saw the world. History's quiet verdict in the end. The story of Japan's prisoners was not about victory or defeat, but about what survives when violence ends. The Americans, hardened by years of relentless combat, had found strength in mercy. The Japanese, raised to worship death, rediscovered life in the hands of their enemy. From that exchange of humanity, tea for surrender, respect for trust, a fragile bridge was built across the ruins of empire. It was a lesson that no strategy could invent and no bullet could erase. That sometimes, the smallest acts of decency can outlast the roar of war itself. The war ended, but the memory of that tea did not. It lived on in quiet recollections, in the letters of prisoners, in the diaries of American guards, in the silence that followed when men who once tried to kill each other now shared a moment of peace. The Pacific had been a furnace of hatred. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, it was a war that taught humanity how deep cruelty could go. And yet within that same inferno, there flickered something fragile, a moral instinct that refused to die. When an American medic on Saipan poured tea for a frightened Japanese prisoner, he did not think of diplomacy or propaganda. He simply saw another man bleeding. But history would remember that gesture as something greater. The moment mercy became strategy, and decency became defiance. That small act of humanity traveled farther than any army. It crossed oceans, passed through prison fences, and reached the heart of a nation that had once believed the enemy was inhuman. It showed that victory could be achieved without annihilation, that strength could exist without hatred. In the decades that followed, Japan and the United States would become allies, trading partners, and cultural mirrors. Their bond was not born of shared language or faith, but of shared recognition, of how far both had fallen, and how compassion, even in war, could begin to rebuild what was broken. The steam from that small cup of tea rose into the humid air of Saipan in 1944 and vanished. But its meaning did not. It lingered, in treaties, in friendships, in the quiet respect between two nations that once sought each other's destruction. In every war, there are weapons that never fire, gestures, words, moments of mercy. They leave no scars on the earth, but they change the hearts that survive it. And so, when historians speak of bombs, invasions, and treaties, there is another story to remember, one told not by generals or presidents, but by a single act of kindness on a battlefield of despair. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is not in conquest, but in compassion. If this story moved you, remember, history isn't only about battles won, but about the choices made when no one is watching. Acts of mercy like the one on Saipan still echo through the world we live in. Subscribe for more untold stories of humanity in the shadows of war. Turn on notifications to never miss a new episode. And if you believe compassion can be as powerful as courage, share this film, so that the quiet victories of the past continue to shape the conscience of the future.